How's it going, folks? So I was actually planning on waiting until this weekend to make a bigger video rounding up a lot of the data that we just got from Circana. I wanted to review a few things in depth before just spitting out a video, but a lot of you were asking me to make a video about today's data, so there was one specific topic that I think is worth delving into the numbers for. But first up, to pat myself on the back real quick, I made a post yesterday predicting that the Switch 2 would be at 2.43 million after today's numbers came in. Ended up being 2.4 million, so I was pretty close. And I'm not sure if I'm going to change my mind later, but I think in 2 weeks from now, when we get the September numbers, the Switch 2 will be at 2.65 million. So it's going to manage 250,000 for the next month, which is a 60,000 drop off from this month, but it's also going to be a 5-week month versus a 4-week month, so it's going to be selling at a slower rate. But we'll talk about that as we get closer to October 22nd or whatever it is. For now, I thought it would be a fun activity now that we officially know how many Switch 2 consoles were sold in the United States when the console officially reached satiated launch demand. And by that, I mean the console is in stock, it's not sold out anywhere, and it's still making sales, and it's still going to make sales, but now it's going to continue moving at a regular pace without any of that intense I must have this thing now demand that usually exists when a console launches, and also without any supply constraints at all, like nothing. The thing was very available in June, it was very available in July, but you could still argue that if somebody didn't know how to compete with like the easiest scalper to compete against, or somebody didn't understand when they should go to a store and when they should call ahead and all that fun stuff that people have kind of gotten adjusted to over the past 5 or 6 years, but for some reason Nintendo fans didn't. So there were still arguments to be made that it was hard to grab through June and through maybe the first 2/3 of July. But by the end of August, there was no more any debate at all. So we know for a fact with this 2.4 million units sold for the Nintendo Switch 2, launch demand has officially been satiated and there are zero supply constraints. Good. Let's compare that to every other console that's come out since 2006 until now. Well, I guess technically we'd be starting from 2005 because at the end of 2005 is when we had the launch of the Xbox 360. Now the data that I'm using is all NPD data, which was Circana before it was Circana. These are all available on install-based forums. They were set up by this user that goes by Welfare. Shout out to them. They do a phenomenal job tracking things and an even better job making tables and displaying it for all to see. I'll have a link to this in the description in case anybody wants to jump into the forums and click around the numbers on their own. So the way I did this was I jumped on Google and I searched with the custom time range windows to find when I could see the latest article or latest blog post or comment somewhere with people complaining about stock issues for a specific console on any given year, specifically in the United States. Whenever I felt like the month that I was searching in no longer really had posts of people complaining about not being able to find a specific console is when I determined that that console had officially satiated launch demand, right? Because launch demand is people that want a console as soon as it comes out and they want to grab it, but they can't get a hold of it because it's not available. So for example, with the Nintendo Switch 2, where Nintendo did an excellent job making sure they had a lot available, this was June and the first 2/3 of July. Now I'm going to give the Switch 2 the best case scenario here. We're going to say it's 2.4 million is that number that people were looking for. When I was tracking sales, it slowed down dramatically in the second half of August, so it might actually be fewer than 2.4 million. But I like that 2.4 number. It's a good spot, and compared to everything else, you'll soon see that this thing was not actually in demand as much as people expected. Actually, most people understand that it was not in that demand, but there are some people out there that still think this is just the most in-demand console that's ever existed. But it's all because of stock, and we'll go through this exercise together and learn that as we move along. So we'll start off with the consoles that reached satiated launch demand sooner than the actual Switch 2. Coming in last place is the PlayStation 3. The PlayStation 3 launched in 2006, right around the holiday season. They sold 688,000 consoles, and reportedly they had not burned through the available stock through the end of that year. So they had 688,000 and that was it. Basically everybody that felt like they needed a PlayStation 3 at launch had gotten one. The PlayStation 3 of course would have a second and even a third life with further price drops, but I'm trying to just focus specifically on launch window where people are the least sensitive about price points and they have to have an item as soon as it drops. Following that, we actually have the Xbox 360. Interestingly enough, the Xbox 360 actually sold fewer through the end of its first year than the PlayStation 3 did. It released a year prior, it had no competition, but I guess they had burned through their entire stock during that holiday window because I see articles up until the April of the following year where people were finally like, oh, okay, like I found this thing. And honestly, I might be being a bit generous because I think there were different versions of the Xbox 360, so some of the cheaper ones were still available, but either way, you're looking at 1.5-ish million. Basically, 1.5 million sold in the United States. Anybody that wanted one and couldn't find one has gotten one, effectively. The launch demand is satiated. After that, we have the Xbox One. This one released in 2014 alongside the PlayStation 4. By the end of 2014, there were 1.817 million sold. And going into 2015, I don't see any reports of any major stock issues for the Xbox One. Oh, I just realized I skipped the Wii U. The Wii U, 885,000 was sold up through the first holiday season back in 2012. I believe it was in the following month where Iwata took a price cut, so I'm pretty sure it was not really selling out even through that 885,000. It might actually be lower than the PS3. I don't know exactly when the cutoff would happen, but the point is that this is like a failed console. I think we already knew that. But it is good to mention it because I think a lot of people have been assuming the Switch 2 would be as bad as the Wii U performance-wise. I am not one of those people. I've been saying that since before this console launch, but I think there's a lot of context when it comes to the Wii U and the Switch 2 that while the Switch 2 will, in my opinion, never be considered as big of a failure as the Wii U, depending on how the next few months, maybe even year plays out, it could still be considered a failure given today's current climate. Although the Xbox Series consoles have really brought down that bar a little bit, but we'll talk about Xbox Series shortly. Let's pause that for a second. Okay, so effectively at this point in time, everything that has been worse than the Switch 2 when it comes to satiating launch demand is removed from the equation. I'd personally argue that the Switch 2 at 2.4 million is almost as impressive as the 1.8 million the Xbox One did back in 2014. I'd say the Xbox 360 pulling off a 1.5 back in 2006 is more impressive, and the Wii U and the PS3 absolutely worse than the Switch 2. I'm not going to try to spin it otherwise. The main reason why I say the Xbox One is realistically worse than the Switch 2, just by a little bit, is because going into that holiday season, that 1.817 is like a maximum value. It easily could have been satiated prior to the holidays, and some of that was like the Christmas bump. Because going forward with a lot of the other consoles that we're going to be talking about, despite the fact that many of them go through the holiday season, they're still out of stock beyond the holiday season. So Christmas or otherwise, there's still very much demand for people that want a console and can't get a hold of it, and very possibly had wanted one from the holidays up until that point in time, and you'll see that as we continue forward. Either way, for the sake of this exercise, we're doing this at face value. I won't get too deep into the different sizes of the industry prior to the Switch 2 versus the Switch 2, so let's just assume that everything I've already mentioned did worse than the Switch 2 at launch. And now we have the Switch 2, which has satiated demand at 2.4 million. And the next one up on the list is actually the Switch 1. So for the Switch 1, it's actually more of a larger window when it comes to trying to find this thing in stock. The latest article that I found that said that the Switch 1 was still out of stock and still hard to grab was from late October in 2017. Through the end of the holiday season of the Switch 1, there were basically no more stock issues going into the following year. And that's because going into the holiday season, in November, they sold 775,000 units, and then in the following month, they sold 1.5 million units. That's during the Christmas season, obviously December. Pretty much everything before that, you could not find this thing in stock. In August of 2017, since we're comparing Augusts, the Switch 1 sold 206,000, and it sold out 206,000. So the Switch 2 selling 310,000, while it's more than what the Switch 1 sold, the assumption here is that the patterns that the Switch 1 continued to build forward going in the following months imply that if there were more Switch 1s available, it definitely would have sold more than the Switch 2. Because we see that demand is not satiated until we hit at least that 2.6 number at the end of October. And quite frankly, I think I'm underselling the Switch 1 number. I think it's a lot higher than that 2.6 number. By the end of the year, they had sold 4.876 million. And that holiday season was the first time there were zero supply constraints. So I mean, even if you said there were like half of those sales were people that were just buying it because it was Christmas and they needed to buy something for their kids, so it was a holiday bump, then like the other half of those numbers could very well be people that had been looking for a Switch for months at that point in time and just couldn't find it anywhere available until like Black Friday and beyond. Either way, I'm going at the least common denominator because even if you just give it no credit for any of the holiday numbers, you can say that the Nintendo Switch 1 very much did not reach satiated demand until it hit 2.6 million sold, and that's at minimum, which is 200,000 more than the 2.4 million sold for the Switch 2, and that's a maximum. So using those numbers, I think it's very clear that the Switch 1 had a lot more launch demand than the Switch 2 does, and the only advantage that the Switch 2 has to make it seem otherwise is the availability of the stock. Then let's just jump straight from there into the next console on the list. The PlayStation 4 is the next console. Using the same exercise, I found that up until March 2014, there were still people kind of whispering about not being able to comfortably find a PlayStation 4 anywhere. So that means despite all of the sales that they made in their first holiday season, even going into January and February, every time that thing would come into the stores, people would buy it immediately because they wanted a PlayStation 4. And realistically, many of them had wanted one from the day that it launched, and they just could not find one anywhere. By the end of March of 2014, the PlayStation 4 was at 2.911 million sold in the United States, and that's where I think is a good number to say that's when they had their satiated demand. So about 500,000 more than the Switch 2. The next one on the list would be the Xbox Series console, but I'm gonna save that and discuss it last along with the PS5, but we're gonna go back in time to the Wii. Now keep in mind with everything I'm about to say for the Nintendo Wii, this was done during like the 2006 and 2007 gaming market. And this was also done before it was as easy as clicking on a website and buying something very simply without having to think too much about it. Like for the Wii, you're looking at most people had to go and line up in front of stores, whereas now a lot of people just have to fight against bots. There was a lot more physical activity required to get a Wii, let's just put it that way. The latest data that I could see as to when the Wii finally started being available for everybody, where they no longer had to fight to get one, is December 2007. That is a year and 1 month after that thing launched. And I could speak about this personally. I got my first Wii at midnight. I was a 12 a.m. purchaser, and then that Wii got stolen. So my second Wii I had purchased the following year. I don't remember exactly what month, but it must have been like the fall window, because it was pretty chilly. And we lined up at around 4 or 5 a.m. outside of Toys R Us. There was like 50 or 60 people in line with us. And that's when I bought my second Wii. So I had to do that to get a Wii like 10 months after the console launched. And it wasn't that there was a Wii shortage. It was just that there was so much demand that it was selling through, something that the Switch 2 is not. And you can argue that the Wii was cheaper, and I would agree. But the same people that would argue that are the same ones that would use an inflation calculator to try to pretend that the Switch 2 is not as expensive because of inflation. So I don't know if you want to use that argument against me. Either way, despite the fact that the Nintendo Switch 1 is like a lot closer with the Switch 2 when it comes to satiated demand, the Wii, based off of this data and based off of this exercise that I'm doing, was at around 7.73 million sold by the time demand was satiated in the United States. Then there were like no chip shortages or anything here. This was just straight up raw, people want this console and they can't get a hold of it because of how much they want it. Now that is impressive, especially considering the size of the market back then. And the funny thing is, even if you remove that entirety of that holiday season, that 2007 holiday, and you just went up until like October, you're still looking at like 5 million Wiis until people no longer had to fight to get a hold of one. But yeah, with all of the old stuff out of the way, let's get into the stuff that was released post 2020, because today's gaming market is very different than previous gaming markets. It's a lot larger. Nintendo specifically is coming off one of the best markets they've ever been in. And due to the nature of how easy it is for people to buy something, including scalpers, we've seen just how absurdly high these prices go up in the secondhand market when people try to flip consoles. So while I'm going through the numbers for the Xbox Series X and for the PlayStation 5, keep in mind that people were willing to spend well over MSRP on these things. Like in the early months, we're talking people were willing to spend double the amount that the scalpers had bought it for. And later on, by the time demand was satiated for these things, they were still making more flipping these consoles than anything any scalper made on the Switch 2 when it was still not available in stores back in June and July. And I highlight that because a lot of people assumed that the reason scalpers were like quote unquote defeated by Nintendo was because they had so many units available. But through all of June and July, scalpers were still very much buying this thing. It was still very hard to get for the layman person that did not know how to combat bots. And the only reason why scalpers were not able to make money on this Nintendo Switch 2 is because nobody in their right mind would be willing to spend more than MSRP on the Switch 2, because it was very much already priced more than it should have been. So anything more than that is laughable. Basically, Nintendo realized that people were willing to spend $1,000 for a PS5, so they figured they would charge $500 for their Switch 2, and it worked, I guess. They outscalped the scalpers by overcharging for their console. But anyway, getting back on target. The PlayStation 5 is actually the highest on the list. We'll do that one before we do the series consoles. There was an article in October of 2023 where Sony said that they finally had managed all their stock issues and the PlayStation 5 will be easy to grab. I think by that point in time, a lot of times scalpers were still grabbing this thing and they were flipping it for a very small margin. And it wasn't that hard to find one in stores, so I feel like I'd be really doing PlayStation a favor if I used October 23 as the cutoff. So instead, what I'll do is I'll peel it all the way back to the end of 2022 and say that that was when demand was satiated. It was definitely not. There were definitely still a lot of people that wanted the PlayStation 5 from the day that it launched until that point in time, but I don't think I'm going to prove my point anyway. That number already by itself is 11.92 million. So you could talk about scalpers, you can talk about stock issues, you can talk about chip shortages, you could talk about whatever you want to say. But the fact of the matter is, at least 12 million people in the United States wanted a PlayStation 5, and most of them were willing to spend more than MSRP on that console. And I would be willing to argue that a very large majority of that number wanted it from the day that it launched, but they could not get a hold of it anywhere. Even if you cut that in half and you're looking at 6 million people, this is why I think it is embarrassing that at 2.4 million Switch 2s sold, there are still Switch 2s available in stock, and not only are they in stock, the amount of sales slowed down from July to August when there was still no supply constraints, and they're going to slow down from August to September where there are still no supply constraints. That means at most you can say that 2.4 million people absolutely had to have a launch Switch 2, which is almost 10 million people fewer than what the PlayStation 5 had. And I realize a few people will argue that hey, the Switch 2 is still gonna sell something next month and the month after that. Why are you pretending that nobody's gonna buy it anymore? But first of all, that's not the point of this exercise. We're talking about people that want a console specifically at launch. And secondly, if reports from Paul Gale, if you trust that guy, which I don't think I do, but fine. His report is that as of late August, I think it was August 25th or whatever, that supposedly the Nintendo had shipped out 8.6 million Switch 2s. Now, obviously these are shipped units. These are not sold to the customers. And we also know that as of the end of July, the Switch 2 had sold 6 million units worldwide, right? Those were numbers that were sold through to the customers. So given how available and in stock the Switch 2 has been over the course of the past few months, that's very realistic that around 8 million, at least high 7 millions were already shipped by the time we got to the end of July. So if you consider by the end of August, how many Switch 2s do you think were out in the wild in the United States? If there's 8.65 million worldwide, at most is 3 million maybe. You're telling me that it's not unreasonable to assume that Nintendo had expected 3 million people to have purchased the Switch 2 by now? You're telling me that it's unreasonable that this whole time I've assumed that Nintendo actually expected that the Switch 2 would be out of stock in the United States, out of stock maybe even worldwide, all over Europe where it's underperforming? It's not like that they're doubling and tripling the amount of units in stock available. There's absolutely no reason that this thing should not be sold out worldwide in the exact same way that it's sold out in Japan, where, again, it's the only place in the world where it's reasonably priced. And part of the reason I say that is because of the Xbox Series X and S consoles. These are consoles that we all view as failures. And even going into the Xbox Series X and the S, many people looked at the Xbox One and already viewed that as a failure. So the Series X comes in with all of the baggage it already has. It's fighting against the PlayStation 5, which is the console that everybody wanted. And even then, this thing was hard to grab, faced many similar stock issues as the PlayStation 5 did. And fans proved that they wanted this thing so bad that they were willing to spend more than MSRP for it. It was so high in demand that it caused the price to go up. And this Xbox Series X and S, because it's a combination of the both, were still sold out until April 2022. And that's both of them, because I remember they were both sold out for quite a while, where they ended up reaching 6.421 million units sold by the time the launch demand for the Xbox consoles was satiated. Now, do even better. If you want to take away the Series S numbers, We have no estimates, but we know that the Series S outsold the Series X. And mind you, just for some data points, the Series S, which was priced at $300, was very much being sold for around $450 to $500, which I think is important to note because I'm convinced that Nintendo saw what people were willing to spend on this $300 console in 2020 and priced their Switch 2 to match the post-scalper price of the Series S. Because that's what this thing is worth, right? Let's be realistic. But anyway, if you assume there was like a 60-40 split between the Series X and the Series S, even then, the Series X will have hit 2.5 million until demand was satiated. And obviously, the Series S, which sold well above MSRP, roughly the same price that the Switch 2 is going for now, would have almost doubled what the Switch 2 did, until that initial demand was finally satiated and people that wanted a console at launch and had to fight for it for 2.5 years to grab one. And now we look at the Xbox Series X and the Xbox Series S as both being failed consoles. Now, in fairness, we didn't always look at them as failed consoles. We looked at them as a console that was performing worse than the PS5 for like the first year or two, until like in the past year and upwards of maybe 2.5 years where we finally were like, okay, the Xbox Series consoles are dying and Xbox is dying and it's just transitioning to a subscription model and whatever. But the point is, I don't think many people thought that the Xbox launch was impressive, even before Microsoft started shooting itself in the foot. And likewise, I think in today's market, given today's demand, especially for a console that's coming off on the Nintendo Switch, there is zero reason that anybody should be looking at what the Switch 2 has accomplished and think it's impressive. Until now, it's very clear that the only thing that's impressive that Nintendo has done was delay the launch of their console in order to have more stock available at launch and allow people to reach that satiated demand level quicker. It's very important to understand demand, and it's why I've been talking about demand for a few months now. You can't simply look at consoles as a function of time, because then you get the situation where, like, the Dreamcast broke the record in the United States, so everybody thought that Sega was gonna be it. But what I know for certain is that with every other console launch, those first 2 or 3 months, let's say the Switch 1, the PlayStation 4, the PlayStation 5, and even the Xbox Series X and the S, in all of those consoles' cases, by the time you hit 2.5 million available in the market, they were still selling out. They'd hit shelves and they'd be gone. But with the Switch 2, at 2.4 million, with probably a good 500,000 available out there, if not more, everybody that had to have a Switch 2 has bought the Switch 2. And this is crucial because this is when the console will have the highest demand. There are a lot of people assuming that the holiday season is going to be a massive bump for the Switch 2. And they're assuming as much because in their minds, they're like, well, the Switch going into the holidays doubled its sales figures. So they expect that the Switch 2 is going to be doing the same thing. But they are completely ignoring the fact that the Switch 1 did those numbers because for a lot of people, they had wanted one for months and they just could not find it anywhere. And we've been saying this for months now. It's going to be clearer and clearer as time goes on. The records have all been set all around the world that first month, maybe that second month. And people just kept assuming and making the most absurd predictions based off of those first months. But all around the world now, we've seen the headlines. We've seen how overhyped the Nintendo Switch 2 was. We've seen pretty much every single market begin to slow down to a crawl. And this is still very early on in the console's life with effectively minimal supply constraints in only some countries around the world. And just like how the narrative is being shifted in so many different countries all around the world, it'll hit the United States as well if it hasn't already. Hype has already died down. People are already regretting their purchases. Nintendo has immensely upped their marketing game on all of these different retailers' websites, sponsoring more and more of their Switch 2 games in their consoles so that they remain at the top of every search, something that was not the case in early months. I think it was around September 17th when I started noticing that. Their share value today is almost back down to what it was when the Switch 2 launched, despite the fact that it had jumped up and peaked around August at an all-time high. The president of Nintendo of America basically just randomly decided to call it quits without so much as a thank you post from the Nintendo Twitter page. And everybody right now has their eyes towards a Pokemon game that costs like $100 for the full package, and that's not including the required Nintendo Switch Online subscription to get the full package. And oh yeah, that game is also available on the Switch 1, which has a significantly larger user base. So there will be a whole lot of people that will gladly play that game without having to spend an extra $500. Basically, what I am trying to get at is up until now, everything that's happened from that 3.5 million opening weekend until now is moving in almost the exact same pattern that many people that were against the Switch 2 had predicted. And up until now, I have yet to find a moment where it stopped going in that pattern. And I have a very big feeling I will be back here in 2 weeks, once again talking about how it is continuing along that same pattern where the hype and the sales and all interest in every matter of the Switch 2 is just dwindling away. As usual, thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.